Ancient tools and burials, plants and seeds, Neanderthals. All these things we make no apology are the study of archaeology. But we don't do dinosaurs.
Welcome back to the Archaeological Fantasies Podcast, Episode 6. I'm your host, Sarah, with my co-host, Ken Fader, and today our special guest, Andy White. Today we'll be discussing giants, all about the giants. Anything you ever wanted to know about giants, we are discussing it because we have Andy White with us. And along with his fantastic blog, Andy has been doing research into the origin stories of giants throughout the Victorian era and the myth as it persists at modern day. Stay tuned to learn all kinds of cool things about giants that you never knew you wanted to know, but always did. Get ready to think critically.
No, we don't do dinosaurs. No, we don't do dinosaurs. No, we don't do dinosaurs.
All right, so hey everybody, welcome back to the Archaeology Fantasies Podcast. I'm your host, Sarah, and I'm here with my co-host, Ken Fader.
How you doing? How you doing, Sarah?
And today we have special guest Andy White with us, who is our not giant expert. Hey, Andy, can you tell us a little bit about you, just so that in case people don't know, because you do have a blog, but can you tell us a little bit about your blog, a little bit about what you do professionally, and how you came to be a giant enthusiast?
Okay, so yeah, again, so I guess I'm enthusiastic about the topic, but I actually use the term giant enthusiast to talk about people who are kind of hardcore believers in giants. So I'm really interested, and we'll talk about why I'm interested, I guess. But so I'm a University of Michigan PhD, 2012. Right now, I'm teaching a visiting assistant professorship at Grand Valley State University, and actually just accepted a job offer next year for University of South Carolina, so I'm very excited about that. So
congratulations, Andy. That's
congratulations.
Awesome.
Away from winters, hopefully forever. Going someplace a little bit warmer. But I work in Eastern North America mostly. Worked here doing archaeology for 20 years or so. And I remember, coming across these accounts of giant skeletons, looking at county histories and that sort of thing when I was doing background research for CRM projects in Indiana and other places when I was first getting started. And I thought that they were really odd. I never really thought much about it. And then it dawned on me a couple of years ago that with the internet now and having newspapers be searchable and having so many documents online, that this was kind of picking up steam, and that several people had, compiled hundreds or thousands of these accounts of giant skeletons and that sort of thing. And then I realized there was a TV show about it. And so I started kind of getting interested in it again and trying to understand the phenomena, both where it came from historically, peaking in the late 1800s, and then why it's popular again now. And I think those are really interesting kind of anthropological and archaeological questions. And there's a political dimension and a historical dimension and a cultural dimension, both in terms of the original question, why were people reporting these kinds of things back in the 19th century, and then why is there kind of this resurgence in interest in them now? And I realized that I couldn't answer either of those questions. So it seemed to me like a set of phenomena that were kind of suitable for, kind of an archaeological approach to looking at it and trying to find evidence and understand a pattern. And I realized it was also something I could do in my spare time. Teaching has taken up most of my time this year, but I found that I could write little blog posts and read old newspaper accounts and surf the web, with a half hour here, an hour there. So it wasn't so much of a large research commitment, and I actually really enjoy it. And so I started kind of getting drawn into trying to understand, both from historical context and also realizing that, and I think that you guys would agree with me here, that we have kind of a duty as people who can make credible statements about the human past in order to point out statements about the human past that are not credible, and to try to make people understand why they are not credible.
Sure.
I completely agree with you. Yes.
Hey, Andy, did you have an opportunity to watch the Jim Vieira TEDx talk about giants? I think Ted pulled it, but that was how I heard about this stuff within the last couple of years. Were you able to see that?
Yes, I did, because it was reposted. And so that was sometime, that was before his TV program.
Right. Oh, yeah, for sure.
But I remember.
Yeah, a couple of years, I think.
Yeah, I remember I did watch it, or most of it, and I was impressed by the amount of information he had pulled together, because again, I had no idea that these accounts were that common or, that numerous. And I was actually impressed at that point with his sincerity. I thought that he looked like someone who really genuinely wanted to know what was going on. and I can understand that. Like, it's a bizarre thing when you go back and, these accounts do exist. They're real in terms of they're written on paper and they were in newspapers. But,
right.
I think that there's another step to figure out what they mean. And I think that a lot of the people who get interested in this topic are perhaps genuinely trying to figure out what they mean. But I think they also are too quick to not think about potential alternatives rather than the obvious that, a supernatural race of giants existed. It's a pretty big leap to make that jump there. So, yeah.
So
go ahead.
So before we get any deeper into this, where would you like to start the conversation about giants and the modern enthusiasm about them? Because you mentioned a couple different things, and I'm kind of interested in the political angle because I'm kind of like politics. But I'd like for you to kind of guide the conversation. And I know Ken's got questions for you. So if you'd like to start us, maybe not as far back as, the chicken laid an egg or anything like that, but I know that there are historical accounts, especially in Michigan, of the giants, of giant skeletons being discovered. But it was my understanding that a lot of those were kind of debunked not long after being announced.
Yeah, I think that that's true. So one of the problems is that I think when you go back to the original 1800s phenomena, which I will freely admit that like this is still something I'm working on. Like, I don't have all the answers. That's why I'm interested in pursuing it.
Right.
I think that there's really zero physical evidence that I know of. The evidence that's out there are newspaper articles and county histories and stuff like that. Some of those things are obvious hoaxes, and I think everybody will admit that they're hoaxes. There are just some fantastical tales, and you can kind of throw those out. Another element that's in there are, megafauna, mastodons and mammoths and things like those. And there are some documented examples of when those were shown to be animal bones that were mistaken, misinterpreted, or misrepresented as human bones of very large human, 12, 18 foot tall humans. And then there's the actual cases of human remains that were dug out of earthworks and things like that are evidently the remains of actual, probably woodland Native Americans. But what kind of went into creating this idea that they were giant? And I think that it articulates really well with kind of the mound builder debate that was going on. You see in a lot of these newspaper accounts, specific terms that have to do with race, identifying the remains as those of a different race, and that their build is different, and they're not Native Americans, and so on and so forth. And that kind of articulates with all this kind of discussion about where the earthworks came from, what it has to do with the biblical context for the lost tribes of Israel or that sort of thing, or, a different race entirely. So I think that's in the mix. And like, that's what I mean when I'm talking about the kind of political component to it.
Gotcha.
And, if you graph these things out, which I kind of have been doing as I collect these things, they make like a very nice unimodal fad kind of curve, like you would see a distribution, and peaking in, I think, the 1890s or something like that. And the 1894 Smithsonian volume was the one that kind of settled the question about the quote unquote mound builders. You see them really trailing off after that, and people don't find as many giant skeletons anymore, and the language in those newspaper accounts changes. And those are all things we can quantify. You can do an analysis of these, and you can graph out by time when certain words come and go, and how frequently they were used. And I think that you can kind of start to parse these a little bit and try to figure that out. And so that's what I'm working on right now, is trying to understand, that original context and what made that such a popular notion at the time.
Right.
And I think there's several different elements in that, and then if you fast forward, there are some early, and Ken would know more about this than me, like the Brad Steiger book, Worlds Before Our Own, which is like mid 1980s or something like that.
Sure.
Yeah.
He's talking about some skeletons with double rows of teeth and all these kind of weird things. And, so I think that might be the beginning of it kind of picking up again, this whole idea that there are ancient races that, precede where we are here now on Earth, and we don't understand them. And the element, though, that really comes through strongly now is there's a really strong religious aspect to people who really want there to be giants. And once I started scratching the surface, I found that was much stronger than I anticipated it to be. Like, I kind of didn't get it, And
really?
Yeah, until I started digging in a little bit and trying to understand why this is so important and why there is such a willingness to accept the shoddiest of, evidence, and just like kind of like this fascination and embracing the mystery of this. And it's really has a strong religious component in this country, at least. That's my feeling.
Yeah.
I honestly would not have expected such a deep religious angle. I mean, I know that, like with the Nephilim or the Nephilim, I know that's a thing, but I didn't realize that it was so religious. I just thought maybe there were people that just really wanted there to be giants for some reason.
Well, I think there are some of those, but I think a lot of these, and you'd have to ask them, but like if you go and you watch some of these videos and you read some of the things that they're writing, a lot of it ties back to, and that's why I got kicked off the site on Facebook, the Real Giants site, because I didn't realize there was like a creationist litmus test that you had to pass in order to be able to post there.
Really?
Yeah, and I was surprised by that. And I think that there's kind of a much stronger undercurrent in why people want there to be giants. And it runs a spectrum from young Earth creationists who want there to be, evidence that everything has gotten smaller over time as the clock has wound down from creation and, degeneracy has crept in. So humans used to be 15, 18, 20 feet tall, and now we're just puny little 6 foot tall humans, and we have less teeth than we used to. That's how they kind of fit this narrative in.
I'm really enjoying how this is tying into the last couple podcasts that we just recorded. So.
Yeah. Now, Andy, the curve that you showed that I saw on your blog was absolutely telling. The numbers of accounts and this beautiful normal distribution. I'm wondering if we were to do the same thing for claims of Hebrew inscriptions in the mounds, we might find a very similar curve. May not be the same people making those claims, but again, this increase and sort of peak before the publication of the Cyrus Thomas book, and then after that it declines dramatically. But now we're getting there's always this residual argument that no, there's something to this, and so we're hearing again people talking about Hebrew artifacts being found in North America and the discovery of giants in the mounds. So I think there may be a parallel process going on here.
Well, and let's since we've brought up statistics and these nice curves that everybody's got, I do want to remind people that not everybody's familiar with how statistics works. Actually, most people are not familiar with how statistics works, which is why you can lie with charts. So just because we can produce these really cool curves, I mean, it means something to you and I and to Andy, but it doesn't necessarily mean something to the people who are like on In Search for Giants. Because as I was mentioning before the show, I've watched exactly half of, I think, the first episode of that show, and it was painful to sit through because I really felt, more pain than any other show that I've ever sat through, because these guys seemed like they were really nice guys. They were really sincere. They truly, I think, believe that they are finding giants, even though they have found nothing. And I felt really bad for them because the gaping holes in their logic and their thought processes were so evident that I just was having a hard time not feeling bad for them while watching that show.
Andy, so often these guys are saying that these skeletons have all been secreted away by the Smithsonian, right? What's that about? Where are they getting this notion that there's a conspiracy to keep the truth actually under wraps? Where does that come from?
So Jason Colavito has a nice blog post where he tried to find the origin of the Smithsonian conspiracy.
Right.
Mythology. And so he traces that back. And I believe, don't quote me, I'm speaking on anyway. I think he said it was the first mention he found of it was a David Hatcher Childress book. So fairly recently.
A children's book?
Yeah.
David Hatcher Childress. He's
Childress. Sorry, my bad.
He's an ancient aliens guy.
Right.
Oh, yeah, him. Never mind.
But if you look at these newspaper reports, there are some where, people always say because the Smithsonian Institution founded in the mid 1800s, it's the preeminent, scientific establishment in the country. So they're always going to say, we're going to call the Smithsonian. The Smithsonian will be notified. That appears a lot, not universally by any stretch of the imagination. And sometimes the newspaper reports actually do say that a representative from the Smithsonian came and took the bones. Those statements are in there.
Okay.
What you will hear, though, when you hear the conspiracy theories is you will hear statements that are absolute. all of the skeletons have gone to the Smithsonian. They have all disappeared. I can tell you, and that's another thing I can quantify with the data set that I'm putting together is, you can count the number of times the Smithsonian, and eventually I will probably be able to have a curve also. And, some numbers. I don't know how they explain what happened to the bones before the Smithsonian was founded, before 1846, because people were finding giant skeletons in the 1830s and the 1820s. I don't know what happened to all the bones in Europe, that were being kept by churches, or maybe bones in the Near East that might have been, relics in mosques or something. I don't know how the Smithsonian possibly has that large of a reach. And the conspiracy theory, like what happened to all those. And the fact is that a lot of those turned out to be mammoth and mastodon bones, and they realized that they were no longer human. And these things were found in Europe in the 1700s, 1600s, whatever. So this idea is very convenient because it explains where all the evidence is. Because, of course, my first thing I would say is like, show me a bone, show me a giant human bone, one, anyone, pick one.
Right.
And they can't produce one, not one. That doesn't mean that there's not some tall people out there, and that maybe is where the grain of truth in this is. And I think that would be a really interesting thing to try to understand anthropologically and archaeologically. We treat tall people differently now than we do everybody else, and there's no reason to suspect that wouldn't have happened in the past too. But until you get through all this noise, you're never going to be able to figure that out. This idea that the Smithsonian hid everything, it's like it ties into these other kinds of ideas about I think anti-science, what's the word I'm looking for here?
It's an anti-elitist too, isn't it? I mean, the elites back at the large universities back east are dominating this, and they're keeping it all quiet, and they don't want everybody else to know the truth.
Right.
Well, it's pretty common actually with the pseudoscientific community to blame the Smithsonian for a lot of things, just because I think people actually are giving the Smithsonian a whole lot more power than the Smithsonian actually has. Yeah. But that's, I think, a lot because they don't understand what the Smithsonian is. Like, a lot of people, when you mention the Smithsonian, they're thinking the Natural History Museum and not realizing that the Smithsonian has branches everywhere. We have a Smithsonian related museum here in Indianapolis. The Idle-Jork's actually part of the Smithsonian Native American collective, but it's considered one of the Smithsonian museums because of that. But I don't think people understand that that's what it is. They think it's just this one building in DC or near DC. So it's obviously part of a greater governmental conspiracy, and it has all this crazy power to do things. And it's like, they're lucky they get funding every year. I think they really are thinking like of Men in Black, people who show up and take bombs. Absolutely. A train, something like that.
Yeah, they show up in black helicopters, put a tarp over a site, grab everything, and then rush back. Right. I think that this idea that at least some of these accounts, historical accounts in America, are misidentifications of large fossil bones. There's a wonderful book by Adrienne Mayer, or two books actually, where she traces this back even to Greece, where the stories of the Titans and the giants there were, I think she's made a really good argument that those were based on ancient Greek discoveries of fossil bones, which they then totally misinterpreted as being some sort of gods or demigods. And I wonder if, it sounds almost like we're talking about, at least to explain some of these, it's the same thing. People are finding what mastodons or mammoths or ground sloths, and without a kind of body plan how to put it together, they're putting together what appear to be giant humans.
Yeah, but you can forgive that kind of interpretation from the past because they didn't have, or they didn't have as extensive a knowledge as we have today. I find it a little harder to forgive today, especially modern day today, when we've got all these published reports, we've got scientific review. You can look up a human skeleton on the internet, and you don't even need to be looking it up for good reason. You just Halloween skeleton, bam, there you go. So I find it harder to forgive in the modern era than in like the 1880s or the 1890s. We were still learning science then. We know how science works now. We just fail to apply it sometimes. We hope you're enjoying this episode. If you are and would like to support the podcast, please take a minute to give us a thumbs up or rate the podcast on your favorite podcast app. Leaving a brief comment also helps us engage with our audience, and it's good for the algorithm too. If you want to know more about the topics we're discussing, be sure to head over to our Anchor site and look for the show notes for this episode. Links will be in the description. Thank you again, and let's get back to the show.
So, Andy, so if at least some of these are actual human skeletons, how are, in these newspaper reports, how are they getting the measurements so wrong? Is there one answer or multiple answers?
I think there's probably multiple answers. There's one, I've taken some time and I will look at like individual claims, especially, they're like the giantologists have like the top 10 or 20 where you can phrase and look thousands of places where the same thing has been reposted. So like some of them are really interesting and you can kind of figure out what's going on. Like there was one in Washington, I believe it was early 1900s, like 1912 or something like that. But they are taking, there seemed to be a rule of thumb where they would measure the length of the femur and then they would multiply it times 4 to get the body height, like a real simple calculation. So if the femur, was whatever, 30 inches, multiply it by 4 and you would come up with the stature of the person.
That's 10 feet, right?
You can compare that to, what we now know about femur proportions and statures, and you can figure that was an overestimate, but it was a convenient overestimate because you can remember it,
Sure.
Is 4 times femur length. So that was one way. As you know, skeletons do move around in the earth and appear longer and skinnier. People will tell fish stories. So I think there's definitely a little bit of an exaggeration component. Like if people were actually taking a tape measure to each one of these skeletons, why would we have so many 7 foot and 8 foot? How come there wouldn't be any 7'1" or 7'2" or 7'3"? They're rounding up.
Yeah.
That's part of it. And, oftentimes too, you'll find that like some of the ones I've looked at, people are remembering things from when they're smaller or when they're children. And, I think they're just remembering wrong. And some of them are completely fraudulent. I'm convinced of that. Maybe not all of them. And then the Smithsonian itself reports, some 7 foot skeletons. And those, I think, are accounts that are worth taking note of and looking at. There's no reason to assume that there aren't some actual real 7 foot skeletons somewhere. But
something else
is there claimed to be? I really doubt it.
Well, something else to remind people of. There might have been a 7 foot tall person back in the day.
Yeah.
Just because there's one incredibly tall person does not mean that everyone back in the day was 7 feet tall.
No, I think there's a real leap, and it's another thing that's very kind of Victorian and strange, that this idea of race, there being a race of giants, and that term is used over and over and over again.
Right.
Yeah.
And I think it's being used in a very 19th century way, that it's a distinctive biological discrete population that we can identify, and they were giants, and here's what their genetics would have been like, and so on and so forth. I think that's how giantologists are using race. They're not using it as like, oh, here's a few tall people within normal range of human variation. They are thinking of a race of giants, and that's one of the reasons why they really like the double rows of teeth thing, because
exactly, I was going to ask that question.
Yeah, it's portrayed as a genetically passed on feature.
Andy, could you explain that? Because a lot of folks listening may never have heard of this claim of double rows. Where does that come from?
Okay, so that comes straight from those accounts. Now, this is complicated, but it's also super interesting. And this is one of the things that got me going when I watched the first episode of the Search of Giants thing, right, because I had already done some work on this. Because it shows up in these accounts over and over and over again. You see the term double associated with teeth or rows of teeth. And it turns out there's several different things going on. And I have a lot of blog posts where I've gone into this also. It's basically a linguistic mirage. A double tooth in the 1800s and previously was a synonym for a molar tooth or a grinding tooth. And it was called a double tooth because it had multiple cusps on it or multiple roots. So there was kind of a folk classification of teeth in the mouth of double teeth and single teeth. And you can find, dental literature and other things referring to double teeth being pulled and how much harder it was to pull them in the days before, anesthetic and so on. And it goes back, you can find mentions of it in Shakespeare and Dickens and other writers and whatever. It was a very common thing. So one of these double teeth kind of phrases that's being used is there's the phrase double teeth all around. And what that is referring to, and I've got
I see
documents, from dentists talking about this and debunking it in the 1800s, that people would say, my uncle had double teeth all around. And what they meant was that he had molar teeth or grinding teeth all around his jaw, like, in place of the single teeth in front. And those teeth were the regular incisors and canines and other teeth that are in the front of your mouth, but they were worn down heavily in a way that our teeth do not wear now because we have a very soft processed diet. So they looked like round double teeth. They looked like molar teeth.
Sure.
So you see this phrase over and over and over again. That's what it means, and that one was kind of easy to figure out. That doesn't but the giantologists will say that means that's the same as having double rows of teeth, and it's not. It's a separate linguistic idiom that you can trace historically, and it disappears, and people don't use it anymore, which is why it sounds odd to us today. The other one is double rows of teeth. Like you actually see the phrase double rows of teeth. And so this is one that I'm working on now, and it's really interesting because it's used in several different ways. It's used to describe animals that actually do have multiple rows of teeth, like sharks, some snakes, some fish. It's also used to describe actual cases of doubled up teeth or kind of multiple layers of teeth in humans, like where the deciduous baby teeth don't fall out, the permanent teeth grow in, so you have a double row of teeth. So that's what I think most giantologists think that it means. And then it's also used to describe a nice smile, like she showed a double row of teeth in her beautiful face. You know, it's used over and over again in the press in ways like this that just are letting you know that I have 2 full rows of teeth. And so it's used in a lot of different ways, a similar phrase, and it's really interesting linguistic problem to try to sort that out. But you can find many examples where it's used to describe living people with a perfectly normal dentition. So when it's used to describe a skeleton, why do you assume that it's describing some kind of supernatural or genetic trait about teeth? You know, is there another reasonable explanation? And yeah, you know, people can look at a skull without flesh on it and describe something about it, and they're going to probably notice the teeth because that's one of the parts of the skeleton we recognize because we see it every day. Mm-hmm. And they often were commenting on how perfect the teeth were because especially in the mid-1800s, dental health was terrible in this country and almost nobody had all their teeth. So a lot of Native Americans, especially, you know, archaic and woodland Indians that didn't have a lot of starch in their diet had pretty healthy teeth, and they have skeletons that have a lot of whole teeth in there. And so I think that probably impressed a lot of the people who were seeing these things, and they were commenting on that, and they weren't trying to imply that there's anything bizarre about their skeletons. I think it's quite to the contrary. They were implying that they, you know, actually looked quite healthy. That's mine. But I think the interpretation of a lot of those accounts is going to come out to be.
Andy, I think this is a really important concept here, that just because you can read something in the 21st century and you think, well, that's simple English, I know what it means. That's a naive interpretation of historical documents. You know, you've got to understand the way those you call them idioms. You have to understand the idioms of the time. And so just because you read double rows of teeth to me means 2 separate rows of teeth. But obviously that's not what it meant. And I think in your blog you mentioned some very famous people who we all know about who were described at the time as having double rows of teeth. Was it Teddy Roosevelt?
Yeah.
Well, he had some impressive chompers, though. So
when you think of the kind of stereotypical image of Teddy Roosevelt, he's got these big, beautiful, perfect teeth. But as you point out in the blog, those were described as double rows. And was it Jack Johnson as well, the boxer?
Yeah. There's, you know, actresses, actors, comedians, whatever. And like, I like those examples because it's hard to make the argument that there's something bizarre or crazy about them because they're known individuals. And here's a picture, you know, and it's a person smiling, and that's exactly what they're describing there. And
right, exactly.
So it's interesting because we don't use that phrase to describe it anymore. But yeah, I think, you know, you've got to put these accounts in the context of the language of the day.
Absolutely.
I mean, we have all kinds of strange phrases we use now, like still with the word double, like we describe things as, you know, a person as being double jointed. Does that mean he actually has double joints? Is somebody going to read that 200 years from now and go, this person was double jointed? It must have been an alien or, you know, human.
Well, it'll be
hybrid.
Interesting to see 20 years from now if that's how it's as being interpreted, actually. So, I mean, I don't put it past people.
But Andy, you're spot on that when you combine great height and a completely different dentition, that's used to demarcate a separate race entirely. But now, and I know that Jason has gotten into this a little bit, Jason Colavito, but this whole notion that these giants are what? The product of interbreeding between fallen angels and human beings? Is that what some people say that's what the Nephilim are? Now, do you encounter that a lot in the giantological literature?
Yes. So I have started trying to understand and figure out what they're talking about. And again, it like, you know, I'm not a theologian. I'm not like, I don't want to feel like I'm bashing religion or anything like that. But I think that, you know, objectively, a lot of this stuff is coming from very fundamentalist, literal interpretations of the Old Testament that are different, definitely from what I learned in Sunday school. They're attributing these matings from this really very few lines of text in the Old Testament, Genesis 6:4, and then a few things that come after that, indicating that there were fallen angels. They mated with humans. They produced giant offspring. Those giant offspring were corrupt because they were not, completely human. They threatened to corrupt the entire earth. God was displeased. That is why he brought on the flood, is to cleanse the earth of the Nephilim. Somehow they were not all cleansed. So somehow they persisted either on the ark or the angels came down again. And you can find all kinds of different scenarios for how this would happen. But they reappear after the flood. They have infested the promised land. So when Joshua goes in with his armies, they commit a genocide to get rid of all the Nephilim. And these are mentioned as being giants. There's the sons of Anak or Anak, however you would pronounce it.
Right.
Goliath is in there. Like there's all kinds of groups that are said to be giants. So the Israelites are told to wipe them out, and they do, but they don't get all of them. Some of them escape, and the Bible says that. And this is what opens the door to these offspring of giants, of these original matings, corrupt matings, being able to be found in other parts of the world, like the New World, for example. And we've got people writing the Nephilim Chronicles in the Ohio Valley and stuff like that, and trying to put the giant skeletons from here, or the reports of giant skeletons, into that same biblical framework.
And that gets us right back to the whole Lost Tribe storyline.
Yeah, it does. It articulates, it fits in, really well in some kind of worldview like that, where you've got, people from the Near East coming over. Somehow it connects the New World to the Bible stories,
right?
Connects the past to the present in those kind of ways. And a lot of these people who really like the Nephilim, they want them to have a big role, both in history and in prehistory and in the present. So they are still looking. These Nephilim are still trying to corrupt the world today, corrupt our bloodline, and they are still looking for signs of these people that are related to these matings, what they would look like physically, what their blood type would be, what their genetics would be like. And that's, to me, where it starts to get pretty creepy and pretty scary.
Oh, absolutely, for sure.
Where they're trying to define what this mythical race looks like and then trying to apply it to modern day people.
They're trying to use it to classify and understand events and people today. And that is a toxic, dangerous path to go down, if you ask me. And
Yes, I agree with you completely.
I think a lot of these people are selling books, and they're selling their DVDs, and they're being very, kind of trying to say whatever's going to make them a buck. But I think that they're playing with fire doing this, because somebody's going to do something stupid someday. And
you can't rule out it being intentional as well. I mean, Ken and I have both brought this up in Ken's books and on my blog about how the racism of the whole concept of, it couldn't possibly have been native peoples. It had to be somebody else. It's very quiet racism. And I think that's what the way you're describing the this need for a race of giants. It sounds to me like that's kind of following the same lines. I don't think it's intentional, but it is very quiet and very definitely a form of racism. So,
and it really does get scary. The other day I watched YouTube. I think it's one of the Quail. This guy Quail. I mean, he's talking about that these giants want to kill every single human being. So we have to prepare ourselves for this Armageddon, this great war against these giants. And I walk around a lot. I haven't seen any 10 or 12 foot tall people walking around, carrying guns or anything. But it's just, it is kind of scary, this undercurrent of, there's an undercurrent of fear. And then, of course, there's this conspiracy. We're all in this conspiracy to hide the fact that these giants were here in the past. They're still here somewhere. And in one of these YouTube videos, the idea was that not only are these guys giants, but they have some way of scoping out our DNA so that they can follow
they can
us.
Scan us with their eyes or something?
They can scan our blood, figure out our DNA so they know who to kill. And that gets really worrisome, because are people going to start arming themselves against these non-existent Nephilim? And how do you know who's a Nephilim? It is actually pretty darn scary.
Well, there's people who are arming themselves against the lizard people. I'm not making this up. I am not making that up. They really do believe there is a race of lizard people that are running the world, and they are armed and prepared to go to war. I mean, just any of Icky's stuff.
The reptile people, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, So it would not be terribly surprising to me to find out that there is somewhere a group of people that are armed and prepared to fight against the oncoming giant army. But how do these people reconcile real human beings who suffer from giantism? Because we do technically have giants in society today. There are people who suffer from a physical disability called giantism, which causes them to grow very, very tall. Andre the Giant was one of them.
As a kid growing up, I loved Andre, and he was an enormous.
And he
person.
wasn't the tallest. He wasn't the tallest man alive, and his giantism, actually, from what I understood, was kind of mild because he was still able to be mobile by himself and wrestle. I mean, he was pretty flexible. But a lot of people that I have seen who have been recorded with having giantism, they have a very hard time walking. They're very top heavy. A lot of them walk with a cane because they just can't support their own weight. So how do modern giant hunters reconcile human beings who suffer from giantism? How do they fit into their worldview?
I think that they don't. I think that I would guess that most of them would say that's not what we're looking for. We know that humans get tall. We are looking for a race of quasi superhumans. And here's the origin. If the Nephilim enthusiasts like that corrupted bloodline, and they're not fully human because they have, they're part fallen angel, whatever.
Right. Mm-hmm.
So I think that that they would probably dismiss that.
No, I was just wondering if you'd encountered anything about that in your research.
Now, among the giant enthusiasts, what connection do they make between the giants and the mounds of Ohio and Illinois and Indiana? Are they saying that the giants built those things? Because ostensibly sometimes giant bones have been found inside of them. So what connection do they make?
Yeah, no, I think that again, like this kind of resurgence resonates really well with kind of a resurrection of the mound builder myth. They're looking for a giant race of people who would have been somehow in control of these societies and would have been, building these earthworks. And like in Jim Vieira's case, like they're looking at a lot of big stone constructions. That I'm guessing most are, probably New England colonial period or whatever. Right. I don't know about that stuff, but Sure. And it's the same, like in the same way as like a lot of the ancient aliens people, when you look at something that was built in a way that maybe you don't really understand how these societies were using human labor, as capital without any kind of mechanized equipment to build stuff, you go, how could that possibly be? So giants is a great explanation for that, right? Because you can move big rocks, you can move a lot of dirt. One of these guys that I ran across, Frederick Larkin from the mid-1800s, said that the mastodon would have had to have been domesticated to build the earthworks.
Isn't that amazing? I love that.
And that is truly, what is that, the Flintstones?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Well, the Flintstones had dinosaurs, but mammoths and mastodons are almost as good. It is kind of big. I mean, it's amazing. It's in a very sad way. When you go back to the 18th century and you find folks, or even 17th and 18th centuries, people talking about the mounds and saying, well, it's obvious the Indians could not have done it, but the suggestions are made that it was ancient Egyptians or it was Phoenicians or lost tribes of Israel. And how far have we come that now it's the 21st century and you got folks saying, well, clearly the Indians didn't do it. It was giants or the offspring of Nephilim, fallen angels and human females. We're not really progressing in the alternate community here. We're backwards.
Two things here. It really sucks to be a human female. I just want to point that out because everything in the planet or everything in the universe apparently wants to have sex with you at some point in your life.
Ancient aliens did, and the giants
Everything.
did.
I mean, come on. We hope you're enjoying this episode. If you are and would like to support the podcast, please take a minute to give us a thumbs up or rate the podcast on your favorite podcast app. Leaving a brief comment also helps us engage with our audience, and it's good for the algorithm too. If you want to know more about the topics we're discussing, be sure to head over to our Anchor site and look for the show notes for this episode. Links will be in the description. Thank you again, and let's get back to the show. What evidence are they putting forward to support the idea that these giants, these Nephilim, are building the mounds? I mean, other than an occasional skeleton that doesn't exist anywhere for them to produce as evidence. Are they presenting tools? Are they presenting any kind of like, I don't know, writings or something like that? I mean, do they have anything that they can fall back on other than somebody somewhere told me there was a giant buried here, therefore the mounds must have been made by giants?
No, I think the strongest part of their argument they see is there are, it's much easier to imagine a giant person lifting this big rock than it is to imagine several smaller people lifting the big rock.
Oh my God, yeah.
Even though we can prove that can be done.
Right. And I mean, people have made this mistake all throughout history. Saxo Grammaticus said that giants had built some of the stone ruins in Northern Europe, and they were Roman. But he didn't know that. He just didn't. They weren't in his experience something that he could explain. This, one of the favorite ancient aliens constructions is this Baalbek in Lebanon, because it has these giant stones for a retaining wall, and it was built by the Romans, I believe. Is that right, Ken?
I think so, yes, yeah.
And I think that we know about it, and it's been demonstrated and it's been studied, and you can find videos online explaining how this was done, but you hear this time and time again. It had to be aliens because no human could possibly move that big rock. It had to be giants. And Joe Taylor, the creationist giant guy, says that a lot of these things on the earth that are hard to explain, like the pyramids and like the ruins at Baalbek, make a lot of sense if you put giant people in there, because then it's easy to move those big rocks around. I mean,
and this is why I get irritated at the Discovery Channel and the History Network and that kind of crap, because they purposefully put people on these shows that will say that kind of shit. Excuse me, that kind of stuff. And the average person doesn't have the ability to discern that person is making things up because they're making an argument from ignorance. The average person says, "Oh, I'm watching a show on Discovery Network, which is supposed to be, the show for the channel for intelligent programming, and here's this guy telling me that giants or aliens must exist. Therefore, well, maybe they do."
Yeah.
And it pisses me off because they refuse to bring on people who will give you actual facts to counter that crap, and they're okay with it. They're okay with running with that.
I know. That's why I think that we have a duty to respond, and to make a counter argument.
No, I completely agree with you.
I think a lot of people, like a lot of professional archaeologists, might think that I'm wasting my time by doing this. And I know Brad Lepper wrote a post once where he said that he gets that, also.
That's very typical, Andy. You're going to get that a lot from colleagues.
Yeah.
But I don't feel like I'm wasting my time, and I talk in my classes I'm teaching now. I'm teaching both human origins and origins of civilization. And I will use clips from Ancient Aliens and from Ancient Aliens Debunked, just briefly, to demonstrate that all explanations of the past are not equally credible, and you give these guys a megaphone on the TV shows, and that's what they have. And they're reaching an audience that archaeologists have traditionally, I think, done a poor job of reaching.
Yes.
And so I think that, we have the same internet that they do, right? There's no reason why we can't present an alternative. And it's one thing to say, that's not true. That's not the true story. But you have to put something else in its place and say, here's what a better explanation is,
Right.
And I've learned a lot just in the past few months, going through the giant stuff, because I'll see things that's I'm not sure how I would rebut that. But, you get into it and then, well, here's why it doesn't make sense, but that's not immediately obvious. And it's not immediately obvious to other people, who aren't going to put in the time to do that. So I feel like it's part of my job, really as a public academic person to make the argument, to present a counter argument, and to not just sit there and watch this nonsense, because
absolutely
it's nonsense.
I appreciate you saying that, Andy, because I have been rallying for that I've had my blog for 5 years now. And I think every year I write a blog post about how we as the academic community need to reach out to people. We need to explain to them what archaeology is so that they can recognize what it's not when it's being fed to them on television and in the news and through these magazines and stuff.
Yeah, one of the things that I've been doing for years and years and years is just polling students. And I think it's really important for anybody interested in archaeology to realize that if my students and the students that I've polled are a representative sample of people of a certain age, very few of them are true believers in any of this stuff, in giants or Atlantis or ancient aliens, but they're curious. And if all they see on television are stories supporting these claims, they walk away thinking, well, there must be something to it because I don't hear any other explanation.
Right.
So they don't know, but they're curious. They're willing to accept something if it's presented with a decent argument. But if that's all they hear, that's what they walk away from. And that's on us. That's our bad if we don't say, hey, listen, we actually do know pretty much how they built the pyramids. We have a number of different techniques. We've got experimental replications, and we can show that. I loved the story that if in fact people are claiming that 10-foot tall giants built the pyramids because they're so much bigger than us, I'm thinking, wait a minute, the average stone size in the Great Pyramid is 2.5 tons. If a 10-foot tall giant is twice as strong as I am, he still can't pick up 2.5 tons by himself. It doesn't make any sense.
Right. But people don't have the ability to put. And I'm not saying people are stupid. I'm just saying it's not in the average person's toolbox to be able to put those kind of details together. I blame the schools and I blame the media. We've dumbed down the population. We take away their ability to think critically. We don't teach it anymore. So when situations come up where they need to think critically, like, okay, so even if I do have a 10-foot tall person, they still can't lift this damn stone. It's too heavy. You know, I mean, that's a duh moment for us, but it's not for the average person. And then you get these television shows where you get somebody who has, you know, giantology researcher underneath his name held up there, or, you know, doctor or whatever, because you can be a doctor no matter what. I could be a doctor tomorrow if I wanted to be, you know, but you give these people fake authority. You put them on a television network where they're supposed to be learning something. And of course, they're going to 9 times out of 10, they're going to be like, oh, okay, this guy must know what he's talking about.
I think this is why Andy's blog is so important.
Yes.
It's you know, and I'm shout it from the rooftops. Your work, Andy, has been absolutely definitive. I've heard about giants for years. I never knew exactly. I mean, I thought I had this general idea, of course, that there had to be something wrong with these claims, but I did not look into it. And you have, and I think you've done the definitive job here. And I've worked for years and years and years in the skeptical community, and I've seen a lot of stuff. Every once in a while, you see something that is absolutely definitive, where the claimants can fold up your tents, go home, folks, because this person has shown definitively that it's a crock. And I include in that Lawrence Cush's book on the Bermuda Triangle, Bermuda Triangle Mystery Solved. I include in that James Randi's book on Nostradamus, The Mask of Nostradamus. Those guys went back to primary sources. They didn't rely on secondary and tertiary sources. They went back to primary sources. Randi went back and translated the archaic French for himself to indicate, to show what exactly Nostradamus said. And I think that your work, your blog really belongs right up there. You have gone back to the original sources. And when you do that, I can't imagine anybody looking at the stuff that you have determined, that you have found, any clear-minded person, and saying, well, there must be something to giants. I think your work has definitively shown what this is all about, and everybody should read your blog. Sarah, we should put a link up on the website. To
there's
Andy's
already
blog.
going to be one,
for sure. But I mean, congratulations, Andy. You've done God's work. Should I call it that? I'm not sure, but you've done a spectacular job, and I just have just enormous respect for the work you're doing.
Oh, thanks.
We're not wrapping up the podcast there, though.
But I wanted to get that in before we wrapped it up.
But I think Andy's blog shows the difference between a trained researcher and somebody who's, I don't want to say amateur researcher, because I don't think that has, I think that feels condescending, because it's not. I mean, anybody can research, and I think everybody should. But there's certain walls that you will hit if you don't understand how to do research.
And I think it's also the difference between a piece of scientific research and then a piece of work that's meant to prove a preconceived point. Right. They're not really doing research. They're saying, what can we find to convince people there really were giants? And I don't think Andy went about that. I think Andy went back, about the task of let's go back to the original references and see what they really say and how those can be interpreted. And that's the valuable part of the work.
Okay, Andy, before we go any further, I want you to tell us about what you think about the Search for Giants show. Go.
I found it very frustrating to watch. And it was actually, I was teaching and I came home and I realized that it was on. So I found it and I watched it. And I think it was that night or the night after when I wrote my first blog post about the double rows of teeth. because they on. So, I mean, this just kind of encapsulates my reaction. What they did on that, maybe that wasn't the first episode. I don't know. I need to go back and rewatch it again. But they talked about double rows of teeth and double rows of teeth. And like, if I had a nickel for every time Jim Vieira said double rows of teeth, like I wouldn't have to be employed anymore. I could retire. And they talked about this and they talked about it and they went and they talked to a dental anthropologist, a legitimate PhD, and she had never heard of the phrase. She didn't know what it was. So of course she didn't, because it's a historical idiom.
Right.
And, so she had no suggestions really, other than saying maybe there were some teeth doubled up in the tooth row. I think that's what she said. Which, that increases the mystery, right? Like, here's somebody who really knows about teeth and she doesn't know what's going on either. Oh my goodness, what do we have here?
Right.
And then they showed what really, so that was something I thought, okay, here's a legitimate misunderstanding that I can correct. So I was, I wrote that and I was like, here's what I think this is. And that was a very popular blog post. And that the reaction I got to that, like, encouraged me to kind of keep going, because it's nice to have like validation right away. Like, somebody's interested in what I have to say.
Right.
But then another episode, they talked about they flew in this guy from Norway, and he had a theory about giants being related to the Denisovans, this new.
Oh my God. Okay.
The Denisovans?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Wow.
The new population that they have like 2 teeth and a finger bone, and they got DNA and all that sort of.
Yeah.
Right.
And so they flew him out, and he's sitting there. He had some kind of medical problem on the way, so they've got him there in a hosptal bed. And the producers hand him a tooth.
Oh, right. Yes.
He produces a tooth on the show, and he said, this is a replica of the tooth from Denisovan cave or whatever. It's one of the teeth.
In the Altai Mountains, yeah.
It's a large tooth. And then they show it up close, and like, I'm sitting there watching on my TV, and it's like, that's not a human tooth. That is not a human tooth. It's got a cusp pattern like some kind of horse or a camel or something. I don't know. So I looked and I emailed him the next day, and I said, why did you, I emailed the guy and I said, that wasn't a human tooth. Why did you try to put that off? And I was still like in the kind of the mind frame where I thought these guys are legitimate. Like, they're trying to figure this out. And he wrote me back and he said, the producers just handed it to me and told me that's what it was. And I didn't know any different. So I said that that's what it was. And he said, it didn't look right to me, but I wasn't quite sure. And if that doesn't tell you kind of the level that we're dealing with here in terms of, the producers wanting a segment, picking like a cow tooth or something out of their pocket, handing it to the guy, telling him what to say. He says it. It's ridiculous. I mean, it's absolutely ridiculous. And that's when I really jumped ship on that. And I said, you know what, this is dumb. This is not a search for anything remotely related to the truth. This is advertising. And I don't know which of these guys on here are getting taken for a ride. Maybe some of them legitimately believe this stuff, but this show is not about anything legitimate at all. It's not about trying to explain anything. And
what kind of reactions have you gotten reactions? I mean, emails or whatever from the supporters of the giant hypothesis. How do they respond to you?
They don't. I mean, and I like, if you read my blog, like I can be kind of rude sometimes and kind of snarky, because one of the things I wanted to do was to get a reaction.
Right.
Like, I think I have solved the double tooth question.
Absolutely.
That if I were a person who loved giants and who loved double rows of teeth, that I would be interested in somebody explaining that,
Right.
But they're not. I don't think that they are. So I have gotten zero.
Well, they're not interested because they don't want to read things that will disprove their theory.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. But so now that stuff has been out there for a while. It's been out for a couple months. So I'll be interested to see, like, if Jim Vieira, doubles down on the double rows of teeth. Like, is he going to keep saying this? Who knows? Is there going to be any acknowledgement at all that maybe the needle has moved a little bit on like what that aspect of giants mean or not? I don't know. Those guys have not said anything to me. Like, I have gotten some good reactions from, like, I read Greg Little's book, read it quickly.
Okay.
He's got a book about giants, and I was prepared to hate it, like I hated all the other ones, but I actually found there was some refreshing thinking and logic in there. And, I disagreed with some of what he had, but like, there's actual falsifiable hypothesis, and like, I can live with this, and so I wrote a blog post about it. And so he reads what I write and he comments on it. And so, there's some kind of reaction there, I guess. And other people who I know are genuinely interested in the topic, like I've made a few acquaintances, but I haven't gotten any really strongly, negative reactions from anybody who's kind of really invested in it. And that has actually kind of surprised me. And I don't know whether they just decided to ignore me or what. I honestly can't. I don't know. So.
Now, what's the background behind you getting kicked off of their blog or one of the giant blogs?
Oh, that was
the Facebook group?
Yeah, it was a Facebook group. So it had like 1,000 some followers on there. So I figured, hey, here's a good place to post my posts, because it said anything about giants, real science, something, something, something. So I was like, well, I'm doing real science about giants. I can post on here. And so I did, and I immediately I realized within a few hours that I was being attacked. They wanted to argue about evolution. They wanted to talk about, radiocarbon dating doesn't work. Like it was basically this. That's what kind of tipped me off that there was a really strong creationist component to all this.
Not that subtle. Not that subtly.
No.
And so I went back and forth with those guys for a little while, and then I came back from teaching class one night, and I was no longer able to log in. So they had tossed me.
Okay.
It's like, boy, I mean, I think, again, that goes back to like the willingness to believe, and like they don't want to have a debate about whether giants are real. They want to have a debate about what giants mean. They want to skip right past the are they real part, and get on to the good stuff. And I'm still kind of stuck back at the are they real part, because so far I haven't seen a shred of evidence that suggests me that they are. So.
Amazing. That's truly amazing. So they're not looking for a dialogue. They're looking for somebody to just kind of parrot back what they want to hear. And you're not doing that, so you're not invited to the party.
No, I don't. I do not think I am invited. I was disinvited to the Giants party.
That's the problem with running into people who are true believers. And I use that term for anybody who's emotionally invested in something. They don't want to be proven. They're not looking to debate. They're looking to tell you how you're wrong and to show you how they are right.
Yeah.
And I mean, it's just one of those things. I get comments like that all the time on my blog, and I just ignore them because I know that it's a futile argument. I might say something, I might correct a little factoid or something if I see something that just really grinds my gears, but I don't address the poster anymore because it just opens it up to a huge long debate, and it just ends up aggravating me, and it doesn't solve anything. Right.
But again, the good news is just because they can yell at you loud doesn't mean that they represent the majority of people out there interested in the topic.
True. Most people who are interested in the topic will not post anything.
Yeah.
They won't even give you a thumbs up. They'll read your thing. They'll be like, that's interesting. And that'll be the end of it. And, I'm okay with that. And I'm okay with people responding. And Andy, you will get way more comments here as soon as people realize where your blog is, because trust me, as soon as the people from the TV show know where your blog is, I bet you will get threatened to be sued.
Oh, that's nice. They know where it is because I posted on their page, like I have.
Oh, they just haven't gotten around to reading it yet. Trust me on this one. Trust me on this one. We'll be talking again in 3 months and you'll be like, I got my first sue notice.
What did I possibly say that's not accurate? I mean.
Oh, that doesn't matter. That doesn't matter.
Yeah.
Well,
Jason's gotten threatened by Walter. I got threatened by some dude.
Yeah.
Ken, have you been threatened to be sued yet?
I'm like a step before that, where people have threatened to sue me to other people, but it's part of the deal, and it's
it's coming.
Perhaps when you hear that somebody's threatening to sue you, that you're having an impact because you're scaring their pants off. Like, oh my God, this guy knows something. But ultimately, the deal here is we are all about open discourse. We are all about people presenting their opinions, and the deal is everybody's entitled to their opinion, right? But we're not all entitled to our own facts, and the facts that are on Andy's blog are irrefutable, and nobody's going to sue you about facts because they can't.
Yeah,
that's true.
One of these stories where the guy claimed to have been an eyewitness to a giant skeleton being exhumed, and it turns out I went and found his birth certificate, and he wasn't born yet when the skeleton was exhumed. And I checked as many different ways as I could to make sure I had the right guy. And, he had some memory of being there when the skeleton was exhumed, and I don't remember the dates now. I'd have to go check. 1876 when he was 12 years old, but it turns out that if you chase back the original source, it was actually excavated in the 1850s before he was born.
Wow.
So, and he had built this whole statue based on a recreation of what he claims he saw. And he's saying this is a very old individual, and I'm not sure, where he was with his memory and everything, or like what the whole story there was. But, the birth certificate is pretty straightforward, if you ask me.
Andy, you are ignoring the possibility of time traveling Nephilim. It's the same mistake you people make all the time. You're so limited in your imagination.
Or revelation, since we're talking religion, Revelation's a big deal.
Yeah, well, I think that's part there. That's the Nephilim story is at the beginning of the Bible and it's at the end of the Bible too, and what people think are coming. And like if you watch one of those Steve Quayle videos, we're talking about the Smithsonian and how big of a reach does this institute supposedly have, around the world and back in time before they existed. And he talks about a multi-thousand-year cover-up. So there's an explanation. There is a cover-up that is extended back however far you needed to go back to cover up the facts that might be inconveniently absent from the argument now. So when you start invoking that, you're not gonna change the mind of that person. But I think that the point of writing these things and having them out there is that if somebody's curious and they search and they haven't made up their mind yet, maybe they'll come across something of mine rather than just something of like that. Right? So,
yes,
absolutely. That's crucial.
Yeah, that's the goal, is to reach out to the people who are still fence sitters, because those are the people who want that information. The people who are going to argue with you don't want your information. The people who are asking questions, they're the people who do want your information.
Absolutely.
Okay, well, Andy, is there any final thoughts you want to say, or any final observations you have about giantology and all of that good stuff before we start our sign-off process?
I would like to say, I'm kind of new to blogging. I know, you've been doing it for a while, but like I kind of really started in earnest with this in November. And I think it's really interesting because I realized that I am writing a book, a blog piece by blog piece. Yep. It's a nice way to kind of organize my thoughts and do it one little chunk at a time. Yeah. So hopefully I will be able to, especially once I settle down in my new job and I'm doing less teaching, I might have time to try to put together a book proposal and actually get something published, which would be nice, and maybe try to, live up to Ken's kind of statement of being the definitive study and, try to put some of this in a format where it's, fully referenced, but yet still readable and hopefully useful. So that's my
think that's a real, Andy. Honestly, God, that's a real possibility. I'll keep a space open on my bookshelf next to my definitive debunkings. I'm serious. One on the Chupacabra, one on Bigfoot, one on ancient aliens, and I'll have one for giants. And that's a space that your book will go for sure.
Awesome.
Ken, you got any final thoughts?
No, listen, this was great. I want to thank Andy so very much. I want to highly, highly, highly recommend people go and read the blog. If you've heard about giants, if you think, well, maybe there's something to, there are so many accounts, go there and see them placed in a historical context, in an archaeological context, in a scientific context, and I think you'll come away knowing a lot more than you knew before, and you will probably come away understanding that it's an interesting kind of ethnographic study, but there were not giants in the earth in those days.
And I would like to encourage anybody who does go and read Andy's blog to share it with as many social networks as you can, because it is a very good blog, and I'd like to encourage Andy to keep feeding the blog by making it a very popular blog. So,
well, I would like to thank both of you guys for having me on. This was a lot of fun.
Sure.
It took us longer than we'd hoped to kind of get it going, but
yeah, sorry about that.
I'm blushing a little bit because of the compliments. I think there's still a lot of work to be done here, and I have not yet begun to fight on this topic. So I've got more things lined up that I want to write about than I have time to write about. So
fantastic.
That's the blessing of having a blog. You never run out of topics; you just run out of time.
And we got thousands of accounts to go through here, Sarah. So it's going to take some time.
Right.
Well, I want to say goodbye to everybody and goodbye to all of our listeners, and thanks everybody for tuning in. And see you all guys in 2 weeks.
Great, sir.
We don't do dinosaurs. No, we don't do dinosaurs. Rated trials as one will call. No, we don't do dinosaurs. No, we don't.
Thanks for listening. We hope you've enjoyed it. Our music was provided by Archaeosuit Productions. If you like what you've heard, please subscribe and rate us on iTunes or Stitcher, and share us wherever you use social media. You can contact us with your questions, comments, or angry email at archyfantasies@gmail.com. You can follow the podcast at www.archaeologypodcastnetwork.com/archyfantasies. You can follow the blog at www.archyfantasies.com and get updates on Tumblr and Twitter at archyfantasies. You can also look for us on Facebook. If you're looking for the show notes for this episode, go to the podcast website at www.archaeologypodcastnetwork.com/archyfantasies. Thanks again for listening.
Dinosaurs, no, we don't do dinosaurs. Rate your trials as one will call. No, we don't do dinosaurs.